The grand ballroom of the city's art museum was a temple of modern wealth, where minimalist white walls were adorned with multi-million-dollar sculptures, and the air hummed with the quiet, confident chatter of the elite. Tonight was the annual charity gala, the pinnacle of the social season, and Arthur was in his element, a king holding court. It was in this glittering arena that he chose to crucify his wife, Eleanor. He spotted her across the room, a vision of quiet elegance in a simple, floor-length black dress. To him, however, her understated grace was an insult. He strode toward her, his face a mask of thunderous disapproval. The narrator's voice would later say that Arthur thought her dress was a $200 mistake, a social miscalculation. But the real mistake that night, the one that would unravel his entire world, was worth $5 billion. And as the camera of our story pushes past her simple gown to focus on the blinding, incandescent fire of the diamond necklace at her throat, we realize the mistake was entirely his own, a catastrophic failure to see the power hidden in plain sight. With a grip that was just a little too tight on her arm, Arthur pulled Eleanor away from a polite conversation with the mayor's wife. His voice, a low hiss meant only for her but loud enough for the circle of investors nearby to hear, was laced with venom. "Are you kidding me with that dress?" he seethed, his eyes scanning her with utter contempt. "It looks like something you bought off a department store rack. We are surrounded by the most influential people in this city, and you show up looking like a goddamn librarian. Do me a favor and don't embarrass me tonight." He didn't wait for a response. He simply released her arm, gave a dismissive shake of his head, and turned back to his audience, a charming smile instantly replacing the sneer. He left her standing alone, isolated in the center of the room, a silent statue under the weight of dozens of pitying, curious, and scornful gazes. The whispers started immediately, little daggers of gossip thrown by women in flamboyant gowns, each one a fresh wound in the public execution he had so masterfully orchestrated. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The brilliant light from the crystal chandeliers blurred, and the symphony of voices faded into a dull, roaring buzz in Eleanor's ears. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the familiar sting of humiliation that had become the background music of her marriage. But this time, something was different. As the gazes of her peers bore down on her, she didn't feel the urge to shrink or disappear. Instead, a profound and chilling calm washed over her, freezing the shame before it could take root. This wasn't just another casual cruelty, another one of Arthur's thoughtless barbs designed to keep her in her place. This was a final, unforgivable act of erasure. In that silent, spotlighted moment of disgrace, the decorative trophy wife Arthur had so carefully curated finally shattered. From the fragments, someone else emerged, the cool, calculating heiress her father had raised her to be. She straightened her posture, her spine turning to steel, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Arthur had just made the gravest error of his life. To everyone in that room, the power dynamic was as clear as the diamonds on their wrists. Arthur Vance was the architect of a tech empire, a self-made titan whose face graced the covers of business magazines. He was the sun, and everyone, especially his wife, was expected to orbit him. Eleanor was seen as his most beautiful acquisition, a woman of quiet breeding who added a touch of old-world class to his new money brashness. They assumed she lived a life of pampered ease in the penthouse he paid for, driving the car he gifted her, her identity completely subsumed by his. It's a familiar story, a narrative that plays out in boardrooms and ballrooms across the world. But if you're here, it's because you know that the most satisfying stories are the ones where that tired old script gets torn to shreds. If you love to watch an underestimated woman reclaim her power and serve justice with breathtaking elegance, then make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. You are about to witness the spectacular implosion of an arrogant man who forgot that still waters run deepest. What Arthur, in his blind arrogance, failed to truly see was the masterpiece resting against his wife's collarbone. The necklace wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was the legendary Aurora heart, the centerpiece of a collection so rare it was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones by auction houses and gemologists worldwide. Its central diamond, a flawless stone the size of a robin's egg, pulsed with an inner light, casting a rainbow of fire with every subtle movement. It was a treasure of immeasurable value,
a piece of history that whispered of a fortune far older and vaster than Arthur's fleeting digital billions. He, with his gaudy taste for flashy watches and ostentatious sports cars, saw it only as a big rock that didn't match the simplicity of her dress. He couldn't comprehend that the dress wasn't the main feature, it was the canvas. It was a deliberate choice, a black velvet backdrop designed to make the star of the show, the key to her liberation, shine with undeniable brilliance.
His inability to distinguish true worth from cheap spectacle was the fatal flaw that would soon cost him everything. Across the sprawling ballroom, standing near a towering abstract sculpture, a man watched the entire exchange with eyes that missed nothing. This was Mr. Caldwell, Eleanor's family lawyer, a relic from an era of quiet dignity and unwavering loyalty. Dressed in a perfectly tailored but unassuming tuxedo, he looked more like a history professor than a legal powerhouse. He held a worn leather briefcase in one hand, its contents more explosive than anything Arthur's company had ever designed. He registered Arthur's cruel dismissal of Eleanor not with surprise, but with a grim sense of inevitability. He had warned her father years ago about the man's character. As Eleanor stood her ground, her composure unbroken, Mr. Caldwell gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent signal of support that passed between them unnoticed by anyone else. That nod was a promise. The mechanisms were in place, the documents were signed, and the silent, patient power of her lineage was ready to be unleashed at her command. The war had been declared, and her general was already on the field. Eleanor did not flee the ballroom in tears as Arthur and the other guests might have expected. Instead, she offered a polite, serene smile to a woman who shot her a look of pity and began to move through the glittering crowd with the unhurried grace of a queen. Her simple black dress, once a symbol of her supposed inadequacy, now seemed like a statement of quiet defiance, a sleek silhouette of power cutting through the noise and chaos of lesser vanities. She wasn't running from her humiliation. She was walking toward her destiny. She found a quiet alcove near the restrooms, a small pocket of silence away from the prying eyes. Taking a deep breath, she looked at her reflection in a gilded mirror. The woman looking back at her was not the timid, broken wife Arthur saw. It was the daughter of Harrison Croft, an industrial magnate who had taught her that wealth shouts, but fortune whispers. She pulled out her phone, her fingers steady as they typed a short, simple message to Mr. Caldwell. It contained only 2 words, but they were the 2 words that would ignite a firestorm. It's time. That 2-word text was not a plea for help. It was the activation command for a meticulously architected corporate takeover. It was the final domino in a chain reaction Eleanor and Mr. Caldwell had been preparing for months, waiting for the precise moment of unbearable arrogance from Arthur to justify its launch. As she pressed send, a series of encrypted instructions were dispatched, mobilizing a team of financial strategists across 3 continents. Shell corporations, dormant for years, awakened to begin the systematic and untraceable acquisition of vulnerable shares in Arthur's company. While her husband was back in the ballroom, accepting accolades and laughing with his investors about his wife's poor taste, the very foundations of his empire were being bought out from under him. He was so blinded by his own brilliance, so certain of his absolute control, that he never imagined the woman he treated as a decorative object was at that very moment signing his professional death warrant. Arthur Vance thought he had won a petty social skirmish. He had no idea he had just lost a multi-billion-dollar war he never even knew he was fighting. Their story began not in a boardroom, but in a quiet, dusty art gallery where Eleanor was volunteering. He was Arthur Vance, then just a brilliant, hungry software engineer with a revolutionary idea and a charisma that could charm investors out of their fortunes. She was Eleanor Croft, the unassuming daughter of an industrialist who preferred the company of old books to the clamor of high society. Arthur was captivated by her poise, by the quiet confidence that emanated from her, a stark contrast to his own restless ambition. He saw in her a touch of class, a lineage that could lend his burgeoning empire an air of old-world legitimacy. She, in turn, was drawn to his fierce energy, his vision of the future, a world he was determined to build with his own 2 hands. Her father, Harrison, saw something else. He saw a man who collected trophies, not partners, and he warned Eleanor that Arthur's love for beautiful things might one day extend to her, treating her as just another acquisition.
But she was in love with the dream Arthur sold her, a shared future built on his drive and her stability, a perfect, powerful union. In the fragile, formative years of Vance Tech, Eleanor was the silent architect of its survival. While Arthur was the public face, the charismatic genius pitching his vision, she was the steady hand behind the scenes. It was the inheritance from her mother, a sum Arthur casually dismissed as pin money, that provided the critical bridge funding to make payroll when their first major investor pulled out. She was the one who transformed their sterile apartment into a welcoming space for networking dinners, her effortless grace and sharp intellect winning over skeptical venture capitalists whom Arthur's brashness had nearly alienated. She pored over legal documents late into the night. Her meticulous eye caught a loophole in a vendor contract that saved the company millions. She even named the company, sketching the sleek, minimalist logo on a napkin one evening.
Yet, as the company grew, her role was systematically erased from its history. Arthur, in interviews and speeches, spoke of his solitary struggle, the lone wolf who built an empire from nothing. Her contributions became inconvenient truths, footnotes in a story he was rewriting to star only himself, reducing her from co-founder to mere consort. Harrison Croft's passing, 5 years into their marriage, was a somber, understated affair, mirroring the man himself. Arthur played the part of the grieving son-in-law with practiced solemnity, but his eyes were already scanning the room, calculating the net worth of the other mourners. The real shock came not from her father's death, which had been expected, but from the revelations in his will. In a private meeting with their lifelong family lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, Eleanor learned the true scale of her inheritance. Her father, ever distrustful of Arthur's character, had placed the bulk of his colossal fortune into a brilliantly constructed ironclad trust. It was a financial fortress designed to be impenetrable to Arthur's influence and greed. The key to unlocking it all was not a password or a legal challenge, but a symbolic act of defiance. The trust document stipulated that full, irrevocable control of a multi-billion-dollar investment fund, a fund that dwarfed Arthur's entire net worth, would be transferred to her the moment she wore the Aurora heart, the legendary centerpiece of her family's jewel collection, at a public event. It was her father's final, posthumous gift, not just wealth, but a weapon. For years, Eleanor let that weapon lie dormant. The Aurora heart, a diamond that held the fire of a captured star, remained in the cold, dark silence of a Swiss vault, a sleeping titan of unimaginable power. She refused to awaken it because to do so would be to admit that her father had been right about Arthur all along. She clung to the fading hope that her husband would one day see her, the woman who had believed in him when he had nothing, the partner who had sacrificed her own ambitions for his. Activating the trust felt like a final, heartbreaking admission that their marriage was not a union of souls, but a business arrangement that had soured. She told herself that true power was not in wielding a fortune, but in the quiet patience of love, in giving him the space to evolve beyond the grasping, insecure man he was becoming. It was a deeply personal and painful gamble, a bet she placed on the memory of the man she had married. Her silence wasn't a sign of weakness or ignorance. It was a testament to her loyalty, a final, desperate prayer that the man she loved was still in there somewhere. But as Vance Tech ascended into the stratosphere of global tech giants, Arthur's ego expanded with it, eclipsing the man she once knew. The driven, charismatic visionary was gone, replaced by a preening monarch who ruled his glass and steel kingdom with an iron fist. His world became a relentless performance of success, where every decision was filtered through the lens of public perception. He sold their first home, a place filled with shared memories in Eleanor's carefully tended garden, for a stark, cavernous penthouse with panoramic city views that felt less like a home and more like a monument to his own greatness. He shed their old friends like a snake sheds its skin, replacing them with a coterie of fawning sycophants who hung on his every word. His criticism of her became more frequent, more cutting. Her love for classic literature was stuffy, her preference for quiet evenings was boring, and her understated elegance was a brand liability. In his eyes, she was no longer a partner, but a relic from a past he was eager to forget, a constant nagging reminder that he hadn't, in fact, done it all by himself. The court of King Arthur was populated by figures who reflected and amplified his worst qualities. Chief among them was Veronica Sterling, a rival socialite with a pedigree as old as her family's dwindling fortune.
Veronica saw Eleanor not as a person, but as a placeholder, a dowry and inconvenient obstacle to the man and money she coveted. Her compliments were poisoned darts, and her laughter always seemed to follow a cruel remark Arthur had made at Eleanor's expense. Then there was Mark, Arthur's sycophantic CFO, a man who treated Eleanor with a barely concealed disdain. He would interrupt her in meetings, sigh dramatically when she asked a question about company finances, and addressed her as Mrs. Vance, with a tone that reduced her to a corporate appendage. This toxic ecosystem insulated Eleanor from reality, creating an echo chamber where his arrogance was celebrated as confidence and his cruelty was framed as strength. Eleanor found herself completely isolated, a stranger in her own home, navigating a social landscape where she was constantly undermined, mocked, and rendered invisible by the very people who smiled to her face. The grand cruelties were built on a foundation of 1,000 daily humiliations. The abuse was a slow erosion of her spirit, a methodical campaign to make her feel small and worthless. It was Arthur turning to a client at a dinner party and saying, "Don't mind Eleanor, her passions are more domestic," effectively dismissing her intellect in front of strangers.
It was him handing her a credit card with a preset paltry limit, an allowance, he called it, as if she were a teenager and not the woman whose inheritance had been the bedrock of his initial success. He would veto her clothing choices, once even sending his assistant to return a classic trench coat she adored because it wasn't flashy enough for the wife of a billionaire. He would make plans involving them both without consulting her, then scold her for not being flexible when she had a prior commitment. Each gesture, each word was a carefully placed stone in the wall he was building between them, a wall designed to imprison her in the role of the powerless, decorative wife. He thought he was breaking her spirit, but he was merely tempering it into something unbreakable. The moment the last ember of her hope for him died occurred 6 months before the gala, on their 15th wedding anniversary. She had meticulously planned a surprise trip to a small family-owned vineyard in Tuscany, the very place where they had spent their honeymoon, a time when their love felt boundless and real. She imagined them walking through the olive groves, disconnected from the relentless demands of his empire, perhaps finding their way back to the people they used to be. When she presented him with the tickets, his eyes never left the stock ticker on his tablet. "Tuscany," he scoffed, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. "Eleanor, I have the Global Tech Summit in Dubai that week. I can't be seen wasting time at some run-down farm." The casual brutality of his words stole the air from her lungs. He then tossed a platinum credit card onto the coffee table. "Go buy yourself a new car or something," he said dismissively. "Just make sure it's expensive. I have an image to maintain." In that instant, she finally saw him for what he was, not a husband, but a brand manager, and she was his most disappointing product. That night, after the anniversary debacle, the grief she had been holding back for years finally gave way to a cold, crystalline clarity. The woman who had hoped and waited was gone, and in her place stood the daughter of Harrison Croft. The next morning, she made a call to Mr. Caldwell, her voice steady and devoid of emotion. Their conversations shifted from patient legal oversight to active strategic planning. She began to devour information, not the poetry and history she loved, but SEC filings, market trend analyses, and dense treatises on hostile corporate takeovers. She transformed her father's forgotten library, a sanctuary of old leather and quiet wisdom that Arthur had always derided, into her war room. She mapped out Vance Tech's corporate structure, identifying its over-leveraged divisions and the shareholders whose loyalty was purely financial. She was no longer a wife grieving a dead marriage. She was a strategist preparing for battle, studying the terrain, identifying the enemy's weaknesses, and waiting, with the patience of a predator, for the perfect moment to reclaim what was hers. Her silence was no longer about hope. It was about ammunition. The annual museum gala was Arthur's favorite stage, the place where he performed his carefully constructed persona of the magnanimous tech titan. In the weeks prior, his arrogance reached a fever pitch. He became obsessed with their presentation, commissioning a famous avant-garde designer to create a garish, overly ornate gown for Eleanor, a dress designed to scream wealth and status. When the monstrosity of silk and sequins arrived, Eleanor knew she could never wear it. It was a costume for a character she refused to play. This was the moment. She called Mr. Caldwell with a single, clear instruction. "Bring the Aurora Heart from Geneva. It's time." She then went out alone and purchased the simple, floor-length black gown. She knew Arthur would see it as a public act of defiance, a personal insult to his authority and taste. And that was precisely her intention. She was baiting the trap with her own apparent weakness, knowing his ego would compel him to walk right into it. The dress wasn't a fashion faux pas. It was the opening salvo in a war he didn't even know had been declared, and the glittering gala was her chosen ground for the first decisive strike. The months following their disastrous anniversary were a masterclass in psychological warfare, a slow, deliberate campaign orchestrated by Arthur to dismantle Eleanor piece by piece. His cruelty, once a private affair confined to the sterile walls of their penthouse, began to spill into their public life with a brazenness that shocked even the most jaded observers of their social circle.
The affair with Veronica Sterling was no longer a whispered rumor. It became a poorly concealed spectacle. He would take Veronica to the same restaurants he once took Eleanor, seating her at their usual table, a public coronation of his new queen. He started quoting Veronica in conversations, praising her sharp business acumen and fearless sense of style, each compliment a meticulously crafted dagger aimed directly at Eleanor's heart. He was not just replacing her, he was erasing her, systematically painting over the canvas of their shared history with the garish, loud colors of his new infatuation. He wanted her to feel not just unloved, but obsolete, a relic of a past he was aggressively disowning in front of the entire world, and she was forced to watch, silent and composed, as her lifeless
auctioned off to the highest bidder. The first fortress to fall was her home. One afternoon, Eleanor returned from a solitary walk to find their penthouse in a state of controlled chaos. Furniture was draped in white sheets, and a team of unfamiliar interior designers were taking measurements, their voices echoing in the marble foyer. Veronica Sterling stood in the center of the living room, a clipboard in hand, pointing at the custom-built bookshelves that housed Eleanor's treasured first editions. "All of this has to go," Veronica declared to a subordinate, her voice dripping with disdain. "It sounds dreadfully quiet." Arthur appeared from his study, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Veronica is helping me with a little refresh," he announced, as if discussing the weather. "It's time this place reflected a more modern, powerful aesthetic." When Eleanor protested, her voice a mere whisper, he waved a dismissive hand. "Don't be so sentimental, Eleanor. They're just things." He didn't care that he was giving another woman dominion over her sanctuary. In fact, that was the entire point. He was making it clear that she was merely a tenant in his world, and her lease was about to expire. Her last bastion of personal identity was a small, fulfilling role she had carved out for herself, curating contemporary art for a chain of luxury boutique hotels. It was a position she had secured not through Arthur, but through a connection of her late father's, and she excelled at it, her quiet, discerning eye bringing a unique elegance to the brand. This, too, Arthur decided to take from her. A week after the penthouse invasion, she received a call from the hotel group's CEO, a man who had previously lauded her contributions. His voice was stiff and uncomfortable as he explained that, following a strategic review, they were moving in a bolder, more aggressive direction with their art acquisitions. He mumbled something about needing a curator whose personal brand was more aligned with this new vision. Eleanor knew instantly that Arthur was behind it. She later learned he had threatened to pull all Advanced Tech's corporate travel accounts, a multi-million-dollar contract, unless she was removed. He hadn't just gotten her fired. He had weaponized his power to methodically sever every tie she had to a life outside of him, ensuring her complete and total dependence on his suffocating orbit. The humiliation extended to the Vance family, who, taking their cues from Arthur, began treating her with a new level of open contempt. At a formal family dinner held at Arthur's parents' sprawling estate, his mother, Beatrice, a woman whose face was a tight mask of disapproval, looked Eleanor up and down with a critical eye. "Dear," Beatrice said, her voice loud enough for the entire table to hear, "don't you think it's time you invested in a more impactful wardrobe? You're representing Arthur now, not some dusty library." Arthur's younger brother, a brash stock trader who idolized him, chimed in with a boisterous laugh. "B is right, Ellie. You should trade those books for a stylist. At least a stylist can improve a stock price." Arthur simply sat back and smiled, basking in their shared cruelty. He had successfully reframed her quiet dignity as a personal failing, a character flaw that embarrassed them all. She was no longer a daughter-in-law, she was a liability, a walking, breathing symbol of inadequacy that they all felt entitled to critique, mock, and correct, all while she was expected to smile and pass the salt. Veronica Sterling, emboldened by her elevated status, became an artist of psychological torment. Her attacks were never overt enough to be called out, but they were precise, surgical strikes designed for maximum emotional damage. At a fundraising luncheon for the City Opera, Veronica, draped in jewels that screamed of Arthur's generosity, cornered Eleanor near the silent auction tables. She feigned admiration for Eleanor's engagement ring and wedding band, classic, elegant pieces that had belonged to Eleanor's mother. "How sweet," Veronica cooed, taking Eleanor's hand in her own perfectly manicured one. She then deliberately angled her other hand into the light, revealing a colossal canary diamond ring, a gaudy and ostentatious stone that dwarfed Eleanor's heirlooms. "Arthur bought this for me last week," she whispered, her voice a venomous confection of false sympathy. The implication was clear and devastating. Her love, her history, her mother's legacy, they were all rendered worthless next to the sheer brute force of Arthur's new money and the woman who was now its primary beneficiary. She felt the sting of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one a reminder of her displacement. The ultimate degradation came during a weekend party at their Hamptons estate, a sprawling property that Eleanor had lovingly restored. Arthur's sister arrived with her 3 young, boisterous children. As the other guests settled by the infinity pool with glasses of chilled champagne, Arthur clapped his hands together for attention. "Everyone," he announced with a magnanimous smile, "I have great news. My wonderful wife Eleanor has graciously offered to look after the little ones this afternoon so we can all relax." He hadn't asked her, he had assigned her. Before she could even process the command, the children were deposited at her side, and the adults turned their backs, their laughter floating on the sea breeze. For the next 4 hours, Eleanor was reduced to the role of an unpaid nanny, chasing toddlers across the manicured lawns, wiping sticky hands, and mediating disputes over toys. She could see Arthur and Veronica lounging together, their heads close, occasionally glancing in her direction with amusement. She was no longer the hostess or the lady of the manor. She had become invisible, a functional part of the household staff, there to serve the needs of others, while her own were completely and utterly ignored. Her intellectual contributions, once the bedrock of their early partnership, were now treated as a joke. During a dinner with a group of venture capitalists Arthur was trying to woo, the conversation turned to a potential merger in the biotech sector. Eleanor, having just read an insightful analysis on the topic, saw an opportunity to add value. She waited for a pause in the conversation and began to offer a thoughtful perspective on the regulatory hurdles the companies might face. She had barely gotten a sentence out before Arthur held up a hand, a look of patronizing amusement on his face. "Darling," he said, his voice laced with condescension, as he turned to his guests, "let's not bore these gentlemen with hypotheticals." He then looked directly at her, his eyes cold and dismissive. "Why don't you make sure the chef remembers the wine pairing we discussed? That's where you truly shine." The men around the table chuckled politely, and the conversation moved on as if she had never spoken. The erasure was now complete. He had stripped her of her home, her career, her social standing, and now her voice. He had reduced her to a mere domestic administrator, her mind and opinions deemed utterly irrelevant. In the solitude of her cavernous bedroom, the weight of these accumulated cruelties threatened to crush her. The shame was a physical presence, a cold, heavy cloak she couldn't take off. She would stand in front of the mirror for long stretches, staring at the reflection of a woman she no longer recognized. The vibrant, confident heiress who had fallen in love with a brilliant visionary was gone, replaced by this pale, hollowed-out ghost. The constant stream of insults and dismissals had begun to seep into her soul, creating a poisonous internal monologue. Was she truly boring? Was her taste really that provincial? Had she become the liability Arthur and his family claimed she was? Some nights she would curl up in bed, the sheer psychic pain so overwhelming that she wished she could simply dissolve, fade away into nothingness and escape the relentless agony of being herself. She was drowning in the life she had helped build, suffocated by the very man she had once loved, and the shoreline of her own self-worth had completely disappeared from view, leaving her adrift in a vast, cold ocean of despair. The absolute nadir, the moment the ground beneath her crumbled completely, arrived on a crisp autumn evening. Arthur informed her they were hosting an intimate and very important dinner party. She spent the day overseeing the arrangements, assuming it was for a potential investor. Dressed in a conservative but elegant navy dress, she descended the grand staircase to find the penthouse filled with their city's most influential figures. Arthur tapped a glass for a toast, his arm possessively around Veronica Sterling, who was glowing in a crimson gown. "I'd like you all to join me," Arthur began, his voice booming with pride, "in congratulating the brilliant Veronica Sterling on her appointment to the board of the Museum of Modern Art." He went on to praise Veronica's unparalleled vision and dynamic leadership, using the very words that had been used to fire Eleanor. The party, she realized with a sickening lurch, was in Veronica's honor. The final, soul-shattering blow came when Arthur, with a cruel smile, handed her a silver cake knife. "Darling," he commanded softly, "why don't you serve our guest of honor her first piece?" It was a public and undeniable act of subjugation, forcing her to serve her own replacement. As Eleanor stood there, the cold weight of the silver knife in her hand, something inside her shifted. The roaring sea of shame and pain that had threatened to consume her for months suddenly went still, freezing over into a sheet of pure, unbreakable ice. The humiliation was so absolute, so profound, that it transcended pain and became something else entirely: fuel. She looked from Arthur's smug face to Veronica's triumphant smirk, and then at the circle of smiling sycophants who were witnesses to her final degradation. In that moment of chilling clarity, the fog of her grief lifted, and she no longer saw them as powerful figures to be feared. She saw them as liabilities on a balance sheet, weaknesses to be exploited. A serene, almost imperceptible calm settled over her features. She sliced the cake with a steady hand, placed it on a fine china plate, and presented it to Veronica with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Congratulations, Veronica," she said, her voice even and smooth, and she meant it. They all deserved what was coming. That night, the trophy wife died, and the strategist was born. Her submission was now a weapon, her silence a strategy, and the war for her soul had just been won.
The following morning, Eleanor bypassed the sterile modern spaces of the penthouse she shared with Arthur and drove to the one place that still felt like a sanctuary: her father's city residence, a grand old brownstone he had left to her, which Arthur had always derided as a mausoleum. She hadn't set foot inside for over a year, but the air inside was still thick with the scent of old leather, wood smoke, and her father's quiet wisdom. She walked directly to his library, a room Arthur had refused to enter, filled from floor to ceiling with books on history, engineering, and philosophy. It was here, in this fortress of intellect and memory, that she knew the answers lay. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, not searching for a specific title, but for a connection to the man who had always seen her strength, even when she had forgotten it herself. She wasn't looking for comfort, she was looking for ammunition. This was not a retreat into grief, but a pilgrimage to the source of her power, a place where the ghost of the woman she was meant to be was waiting for her. In her father's desk, tucked inside a worn leather-bound copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, was a thick, sealed envelope addressed to her in his familiar, steady script. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside wasn't a cold legal document, but a letter, dated just a month before his passing. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, "if you are reading this, it means the man I feared Arthur would become has finally shown his true face. I did not leave you a fortune to make you rich. You were already rich in spirit. I left you a weapon, a tool of last resort to protect the dignity I so admired in you." He explained the trust in plain, loving terms. It was a financial fortress, but the Aurora heart was its key, a symbolic trigger. Wearing it publicly was not about flaunting wealth, but about making a public declaration of her independence. "He will see a diamond," her father wrote, "but the world will see a queen claiming her throne. Do not use this power for revenge, my daughter. Use it for justice. Reclaim not just your inheritance, but yourself." The words were a balm and a command, dissolving the last vestiges of her self-doubt. With her father's letter in hand, she called Mr. Caldwell. His voice, usually a reedy and formal tenor, was filled with a warm, resolute strength. "I have been waiting for this call for 5 years, Eleanor," he said, the words conveying a profound loyalty that brought tears to her eyes. He didn't ask what had happened. He already knew the kind of man Arthur was. "Your father and I spent the better part of a year designing this trust," he explained. "It is legally unassailable. The moment the Aurora heart is publicly documented as being worn by you, a photograph at a major event, a mention in a society column, the transfer of assets is automatic and irrevocable. The instructions are already lodged with the trustees in Zurich. Arthur will have no legal recourse. He can't freeze it, he can't contest it, he can't even touch it. Harrison wanted to ensure your liberation was as swift and absolute as a lightning strike." His calm, methodical explanation transformed the abstract concept of her inheritance into a tangible, actionable reality. The sleeping giant of her father's fortune was finally stirring from its long slumber. As Mr. Caldwell continued, the sheer scale of her father's foresight became devastatingly clear. The trust wasn't just a pile of cash or stocks, it was a living, breathing financial ecosystem. It held a controlling interest in a global logistics firm, majority ownership of a portfolio of prime real estate in 3 major world capitals, and most critically, a silent 30% stake in Innovate Dynamics, Vance Tech's biggest and most aggressive competitor. Harrison Croft had not just built a shield for his daughter, he had forged a sword. The terms were explicit. Once activated by the wearing of the necklace, she would gain not just the financial assets, but full control of the voting shares attached to them. She could, with a single phone call, install herself on the board of Innovate Dynamics. She had the power not only to walk away from Arthur with a fortune that dwarfed his own, but to become his most formidable business rival overnight. The realization was staggering. She wasn't just an heiress, she was a power broker, a silent player whose name had never once appeared on any list of the world's most influential people, yet who held the potential to reshape an entire industry. She ended the call and sat in the profound silence of the library, the weight of her newfound power settling not as a burden, but as a mantle of responsibility. She walked over to the fireplace, where a silver-framed photograph from her wedding day sat on the mantel. She looked at the image of the young, hopeful woman smiling at the ambitious man by her side. There was no anger, no regret, only a deep, sorrowful acceptance. That woman was gone, and so was that man. The marriage hadn't just failed, it had been a lie, a carefully marketed illusion of partnership that she had bought into more completely than any of Arthur's investors.
Her loyalty to him had been a cage she had helped build, bar by gilded bar. Now, her loyalty had shifted.
It belonged to the memory of her father, to the legacy of integrity he had left her, and to the woman in the mirror who deserved more than to be a footnote in her own life story. She picked up the photo, looked at Arthur's smiling face one last time, and then gently placed it face down on the desk. The past was officially over. The initial thought was to simply activate the trust, take the money, and disappear. She could live a life of quiet luxury, far from Arthur and the toxic world he had built. But as she sat there, the echoes of 1,000 humiliations replayed in her mind. His dismissive hand wave, Veronica's smug smile, his mother's condescending tone. A quiet divorce and a silent departure would be a victory for her, but it would leave Arthur's narrative intact. He would paint her as a vindictive gold digger, the ungrateful wife who took the money and ran. The world would still see him as the self-made titan, a victim of a bitter woman. Justice, she realized, required more than just her freedom. It required a public reckoning. It demanded that his empire, built on the erasure of her contributions, be dismantled by her hand. The plan began to crystallize, elegant and brutal in its simplicity. She wouldn't just become his rival. She would use the very mechanisms of the corporate world he worshipped to stage the most spectacular hostile takeover the industry had ever seen. She would buy his kingdom right out from under him. Meanwhile, across town, Arthur was celebrating his triumph. He was having lunch with Veronica at the city's most exclusive restaurant, the very table where he had proposed to Eleanor years ago. He recounted the story of the gala with theatrical glee, mimicking Eleanor's supposed shock and embarrassment over his criticism of her dress. "You should have seen her face," he laughed, taking a sip of vintage champagne. "Like a startled librarian. I think she's finally starting to understand that being Mrs. Arthur Vance comes with certain brand expectations." Veronica laughed along with him, placing her hand over his. "She's always been a bit plain, darling. It's time you had a partner who shines as brightly as you do." Arthur's arrogance had become a fortress, its walls so high and thick that he was completely insulated from reality. He saw Eleanor's subsequent silence not as a warning sign, but as proof of her defeat. In his mind, he had successfully broken her spirit, solidifying his control. He was so busy admiring his own reflection in the surface of his power that he was utterly oblivious to the tectonic plates shifting deep beneath his feet. Back in the library, Eleanor's decision was made. The path ahead was clear, a straight, cold line to a conclusion that was now inevitable. She pulled out a calendar and circled the date of the annual Art Museum Gala, just 3 weeks away. It was Arthur's favorite stage, the place he felt most invincible. It was the perfect venue for the opening act of his downfall. She unlocked a small, hidden drawer in her father's desk and retrieved a velvet box. Inside, nestled on a bed of worn silk, was a single, flawless pearl earring. It was part of a set that went with the Aurora heart. She held it in her palm, its cool weight a promise of the power to come. She would not be the timid, humiliated wife cowering in the shadows. She would be the daughter of Harrison Croft, wearing her birthright not as an ornament, but as armor. She would walk into that ballroom, and with the simple, elegant act of putting on a necklace, she would sign his professional death warrant. Arthur wanted her to be a symbol of his status. She was about to become the symbol of his spectacular ruin. The game had begun. In the days immediately following the gala, Arthur Vance moved with the swift, predatory confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He instructed his legal team to draw up divorce papers, his voice dripping with magnanimous condescension as he outlined the terms of Eleanor's departure. He wanted it fast, clean, and utterly in his favor. Offer her the penthouse and a generous annual stipend, he told his lead attorney, a man as sleek and soulless as his Italian suits. Enough to keep her quiet and comfortable, but not enough to be a nuisance. Make it clear this is a one-time, non-negotiable offer. I want her signature on that dotted line by the end of the month. He was already planning his future, a glittering new chapter with Veronica Sterling by his side. He envisioned a lavish engagement announcement in a glossy magazine, a public spectacle that would formally erase Eleanor from his life and install her replacement. Her subsequent silence and apparent compliance were to him the predictable actions of a broken and defeated woman, validating his every cruel assumption about her weakness. While Arthur was busy dictating her surrender,
Eleanor was in a quiet, oak-paneled office that smelled of old paper and unwavering loyalty. Seated across a heavy mahogany desk from Mr. Caldwell, she was not reviewing a settlement offer. She was executing a meticulously crafted corporate invasion. With a steady hand, she signed the final documents to activate a series of dormant, anonymously named corporations registered in Delaware. These were not mere holding companies. They were financial phantoms designed to move with silent, untraceable speed through the global markets.
Caldwell explained the process, his voice a calm counterpoint to the storm they were about to unleash. The first wire transfer from the now liquidated Swiss trust flowed like a silent digital river, filling the coffers of these newly awakened entities with billions of dollars. This wasn't a defensive move to protect her assets from the divorce, it was an offensive maneuver of breathtaking scale. While Arthur was choosing a venue for his engagement party, Eleanor was acquiring the ammunition to buy his entire kingdom out from under him, piece by invisible piece. The first tremor of the impending earthquake reached Arthur's office in the form of a phone call from his CFO, Mark. His voice was tight with a concern that bordered on panic. "Arthur, we're seeing some unusual trading activity," Mark reported, his words tumbling out. "A single, unidentified buyer has been quiet." Caldwell explained the process, his voice a calm counterpoint to the storm they were about to unleash. The first wire transfer from the now liquidated Swiss trust flowed like a silent digital river, filling the coffers of these newly awakened entities with billions of dollars. This wasn't a defensive move to protect her assets from the divorce, it was an offensive maneuver of breathtaking scale. While Arthur was choosing a venue for his engagement party, Eleanor was acquiring the ammunition to buy his entire kingdom out from under him, piece by invisible piece. The first tremor of the impending earthquake reached Arthur's office in the form of a phone call from his CFO, Mark. His voice was tight with a concern that bordered on panic. "Arthur, we're seeing some unusual trading activity," Mark reported, his words tumbling out. "A single, unidentified buyer has been quietly accumulating a significant position in our stock over the last 48 hours. The volume is high but cleverly masked across multiple brokers." Arthur, busy examining architectural plans for a new Hamptons estate he planned to build with Veronica, barely looked up. "It's a hedge fund, Mark. Probably just rebalancing," he scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Our fundamentals are stronger than ever. Nobody would dare make a real move on us." He was so insulated by his own success, so cocooned in the certainty of his own genius, that he couldn't conceive of a genuine threat. This crucial warning sign, this flashing red light on his corporate dashboard, was filtered through the lens of his monumental arrogance and dismissed as insignificant static, a minor annoyance in a world he completely controlled. Eleanor's strategy was not built on financial brute force alone, it was reinforced by alliances forged in the ashes of Arthur's ambition. Her days were filled with quiet, discreet meetings in forgotten corners of the city. She had tea with the elderly widow of Arthur Thorazil co-founder, a brilliant software architect Arthur had ruthlessly pushed out of the company years ago, buying his shares for a pittance. The woman, who still held a small but symbolically powerful block of founder shares, listened with tears in her eyes as Eleanor offered not a buyout, but a chance to reclaim her late husband's legacy. Later, she met with a retired board member, a man of quiet integrity whom Arthur had forced out for questioning his reckless business practices. These forgotten casualties of Arthur's climb to the top provided her with invaluable inside knowledge of the company's hidden vulnerabilities, and more importantly, a moral consensus. She wasn't just launching a hostile takeover, she was leading a quiet revolution, assembling a coalition of the wronged who had been waiting years for a leader to rally behind. Back at the Vance Tech Tower, Veronica Sterling was already measuring the drapes. Emboldened by Arthur's public anointing her as his successor, she moved through the executive suite with the proprietary air of a queen taking possession of a newly conquered castle. She commissioned a new, more dynamic portrait of Arthur for the lobby and began interviewing candidates for her own executive staff, much to the alarm of the existing employees. Her ambition was a blinding, glittering force, and Arthur mistook it for strength, seeing in her a perfect match for his own ruthless drive. When his personal assistant informed him that a large, legally sealed package from a prestigious Zurich law firm had been delivered for Eleanor, he and Veronica shared a conspiratorial laugh. "Must be her divorce lawyers, finally waving the white flag," Arthur chuckled. He was completely unaware that the package contained the final, notarized transfer deeds and shareholder proxies that gave Eleanor a controlling interest in his life's work. His focus was so entirely on the trophy he was about to win that he failed to notice the trapdoor opening beneath his feet. The financial assault when it came was a masterpiece of speed and stealth. Over a period of 72 hours, the ghost entities Eleanor had created began their systematic acquisition of Vance Tech stock. Orchestrated by Mr. Caldwell from a discreet trading floor, the operation was a digital blitzkrieg. A sophisticated algorithm spread the purchases across dozens of brokers and exchanges, masking the true scale of the buy and preventing any single transaction from triggering market alarms. They targeted large institutional investors who were already nervous about the public rumors of Arthur's impending divorce, offering them a slight premium for a quick, quiet sale.
The market saw only a slight uptick in trading volume, a flurry of activity that most analysts attributed to sector-wide rebalancing. By the close of business on Friday, Eleanor, through a web of anonymous proxies, had silently secured 48% of her husband's company. The sleeping giant of her father's fortune had not just awakened, it had devoured nearly half of its target without making a single sound. The second warning came not as a tremor, but as a full-blown seismic shock. Mark, the CFO, burst into Arthur's office without knocking, his face ashen, a tablet clutched in his trembling hand. "Arthur, it's a confirmed hostile takeover," he stammered, pointing at a screen filled with incomprehensible financial data. "Someone or some group has acquired a controlling stake."
"We don't know who they are, but they now own more of this company than you do." For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear crossed Arthur's face, quickly replaced by a surge of pure rage. "A bluff," he roared, slamming his fist on his desk. "It's a corporate raid by some Wall Street parasite trying to extort us. Call an emergency board meeting for Monday morning. We're going to drag this coward out into the light, and I am going to publicly crucify them. Nobody takes what's mine." His arrogance, though shaken, reasserted itself as his primary defense mechanism. He still could not fathom an enemy he did not already know and despise, a threat that wasn't already on his well-defined list of rivals. He was preparing for a war against a ghost, never suspecting it had a familiar face. On the eve of the board meeting, Eleanor was not pacing in a high-tech war room. She was in the profound, comforting silence of her father's library. The chaos and fury she had unleashed upon the financial world felt a million miles away. On a large leather armchair, she had laid out her armor for the coming battle. A perfectly tailored power suit in a shade of deep midnight blue, its lines clean, sharp, and uncompromising. Beside it, resting on a bed of black velvet, was the Aurora heart. The diamond no longer seemed like a mere ornament. It pulsed with an inner fire, a symbol of a power both ancient and newly claimed. She felt no giddy thrill of victory, no consuming fire of revenge. Instead, a deep, serene sense of purpose had settled over her. She was not destroying something out of spite. She was performing a necessary act of restoration, reclaiming a legacy, a company, and a life that had been stolen from her through 1,000 small erasures. Arthur had wanted a beautiful, silent trophy wife. Tomorrow, she would enter his boardroom as its chairwoman, and her voice would be the one that silenced all others. The city awoke to a cold, gray Monday morning, the sky the color of steel. Arthur Vance, dressed in a suit that screamed power, strode into the Vance Tech Tower with Veronica on his arm, his face a mask of grim determination. He was energized by the prospect of a public fight, eager to unmask and destroy the faceless entity that had dared to challenge his authority. His board of directors, a collection of men chosen for their sycophancy, were already gathered in the top-floor boardroom, their faces etched with nervous anticipation. Miles away, Eleanor stepped into the quiet, leather-scented interior of a chauffeured town car. Mr. Caldwell sat beside her, his worn briefcase resting on his lap, its contents more powerful than any weapon. She was the very picture of calm. As her car slid silently through the morning traffic, moving inexorably towards the gleaming glass tower that bore her husband's name, all the pieces were finally in place. Arthur believed he was about to preside over the execution of an unknown corporate raider. He had absolutely no idea that he was the one walking to the gallows, and that the person holding the axe was the woman he had dismissed as a simple $200 mistake. The boardroom on the top floor of the Vance Tech Tower was a cathedral of glass and steel, designed to make mortals feel small and gods feel at home. Arthur Vance, pacing before the panoramic window that overlooked his city, felt every inch the deity. His board of directors, a collection of hand-picked sycophants, sat arranged around the colossal mahogany table, their faces a mixture of fear and feigned confidence. "Whoever this corporate raider is," Arthur declared, his voice booming with the manufactured certainty of a man who had never known true defeat, "they have made a fatal miscalculation. They think they can intimidate us, that they can steal what I built with my own 2 hands. We will unmask them, we will expose them, and I will personally grind their company into dust." He paused for dramatic effect, a smirk playing on his lips. "This isn't a threat, it's a promise." Just as his words finished echoing in the tense silence, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the room swung open with a quiet, deliberate push, commanding the attention of every man in the room. Into the room walked Eleanor, and the collective intake of breath was almost audible. This was not the quiet, deferential wife they were accustomed to seeing at company galas, a woman who faded into the background like elegant wallpaper. This was a figure of immense and unnerving poise.
She wore a bespoke midnight blue suit that was a masterpiece of understated power, its sharp lines a stark contrast to the soft, apologetic dresses Arthur had always insisted she wear. Around her neck, resting against the crisp silk of her blouse, was the Aurora heart. The diamond seemed to burn with a cold inner fire, a star of impossible brilliance brought to earth. Behind her, a step behind and to her right like a loyal shadow, was Mr. Caldwell, his ancient leather briefcase clutched in one hand. The room fell into a stunned, profound silence. Arthur's face cycled through a series of emotions in a matter of seconds. First, utter shock, then bewildered confusion, and finally a surge of pure, undiluted rage. "Eleanor, what in God's name are you doing here?" he snarled. "Security, get her out of my boardroom." Eleanor met his furious gaze not with fear, but with a serene, almost pitying calm that seemed to infuriate him even more.
She didn't respond to his command. Instead, she glided past the stunned board members, her heels making a soft, rhythmic click on the polished marble floor. She walked directly to the head of the table, to the large, throne-like leather chair that had always been Arthur's exclusive domain, and remained standing behind it. Her eyes swept over the faces of the men at the table, each one a familiar figure who had at one time or another treated her with condescending politeness or outright disdain. They now squirmed under her direct, assessing gaze, suddenly unsure of their place in the hierarchy. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said, her voice perfectly modulated, carrying across the vast room without any hint of strain. It was a voice they had never heard before, devoid of the hesitation they associated with her, and filled with an authority that was both innate and absolute. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. Please be seated. We have a great deal to discuss." Her calm assumption of command was more shocking than any outburst could have been. Arthur finally found his voice, a strangled sound of pure disbelief. "What is the meaning of this charade, Eleanor? This is a private meeting for the board of directors, not a garden party. I don't know what pathetic game you think you're playing, but I am ordering you to leave this room right now." His voice cracked on the last word, a tiny fissure in his armor of arrogance. Eleanor simply looked at him, her expression unchanging, as if observing a curious, noisy specimen. At this cue, Mr. Caldwell stepped forward, his movements precise and unhurried. He placed his worn briefcase on the table with a soft thud and opened the brass latches. "Mr. Vance," he began, his reedy voice cutting through the tension with surprising force. "I am here today as the legal counsel for the new majority shareholder of Vance Tech." Arthur let out a harsh, barking laugh. "You? A dusty family lawyer? Who do you represent? Some ghost from a history book?" Mr. Caldwell carefully extracted a thick, leather-bound portfolio. "I represent the entity that now controls 51% of this company," he stated calmly, "an entity whose principal is in this room." He then turned his gaze respectfully toward Eleanor. The world seemed to stop. The blood drained from Arthur's gaze, leaving behind a sickly, gray pallor. His eyes darted from the old lawyer to his wife, his brain refusing to connect the dots that were now forming a perfect, damning line. Mr. Caldwell, with the steady hand of a surgeon, began to lay out the instruments of Arthur's corporate execution. First came the certified legal documents from the trustees in Zurich, detailing the activation of the Croft Family Trust and the transfer of its multi-billion-dollar assets into Eleanor's sole and irrevocable control. Next, he produced the consolidated brokerage reports, a thick stack of papers that chronicled the swift, silent, and entirely legal acquisition of a controlling interest in Vance Tech through a web of anonymously held corporations. "As you can see," Mr. Caldwell explained to the mesmerized board, "the purchases were made with liquid capital from the trust, initiated the evening of the museum gala." Mark, the CFO, frantically swiped through his tablet, his knuckles white. "The numbers, they match," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and terror. "The volume, the timing, it's all here. It's legitimate." Arthur finally snapped, a cornered animal lashing out in a final, desperate burst of fury. "Fraud!" he screamed, lunging across the table toward the papers, but his CFO instinctively put a hand on his arm to stop him. His rage then redirected itself, a toxic laser beam aimed directly at his wife. You did this? You don't have the brains to order a cup of coffee, let alone stage a corporate takeover.
You used my money to destroy me. Eleanor, who had been silent throughout the entire presentation, finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it sliced through his tirade like a diamond blade cutting through glass. Your money, Arthur? She asked, a genuine curiosity in her tone. Are you referring to the inheritance from my mother, the one you dismissed as pin money right before it saved this company from collapsing in its second year? Or are you talking about the fortune my father left me, the one you never knew existed because you were too arrogant to ever see me as more than a decoration for your arm? You were so obsessed with the frame, you never once bothered to look at the picture. Her words landed with the devastating impact of a final verdict, silencing him completely. She then turned away from his crumbling form and addressed the board, her entire demeanor shifting from that of a wronged wife to a commanding executive. Gentlemen, for the past 5 years, Vance Tech has been run as a vanity project, prioritizing a flashy public image over sustainable growth and innovation. That ends today. She spoke with a startling fluency about market shares, R&D pipelines, and logistical inefficiencies, revealing a depth of knowledge that left them speechless. My first order of business will be to rehire the engineering team that Mr. Vance fired for questioning his last disastrous product launch. My second will be to renegotiate the predatory contracts he signed that have been bleeding this company dry. Veronica Sterling, who had slipped into the room behind Arthur, hoping to witness the
execution of a rival, now stood frozen near the door, a ghost at a feast she was no longer invited to. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had undergone a geological event, and she, like Arthur, was on the wrong side of the fault line. Eleanor allowed a moment of silence for the new reality to solidify before delivering the coup de grace. She looked directly at Arthur, who was now slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out shell of the titan he had been just minutes before. As the first official act of the new majority shareholder, she announced, her voice resonating with the cold, clear authority of absolute power. I am calling for an immediate vote of no confidence in the leadership of CEO Arthur Vance. She didn't have to canvass for support. Her gaze swept around the table, and one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, the hands of his former sycophants went up. It was unanimous. The motion passes, she stated, a simple fact. And my second act is to accept the board's pre-approved nomination to assume the role of chairwoman and CEO, effective immediately. Arthur, your employment with Vance Tech is terminated. Security will escort you from the premises. The words were delivered without malice, without triumph, but with the dispassionate finality of a chapter being closed forever. 2 uniformed security officers, summoned by a discreet text from Mr. Caldwell, entered the boardroom. Their presence was the final, brutal punctuation mark on Arthur's downfall. He stared at Eleanor, his face a canvas of disbelief, hatred, and for the very first time, a flicker of horrifying respect for the woman he had so catastrophically underestimated. He was led away without another word, his powerful shoulders slumped in defeat, his footsteps echoing in the tomb of his own ambition. Eleanor remained standing at the head of the table, the Aurora heart resting against her collarbone, a silent testament to a power that had been hidden in plain sight all along. She looked out at the city skyline, the sprawling empire built on her forgotten contributions, now rightfully hers. You were right, Arthur, she whispered to the empty space where he had stood. The dress really was insignificant. She had her eye on a much bigger prize all along, and now she owned it. The quiet queen had finally, and irrevocably, taken the throne. The fallout was as swift as it was silent. As the heavy boardroom doors clicked shut behind Arthur, sealing him out of the empire he once commanded, a profound and unnerving quiet descended upon the room. The men who had been his loyal disciples just an hour earlier now avoided eye contact, their faces a mixture of fear, shock, and a dawning reluctant respect for the woman who now stood at the head of the table. Veronica Sterling, who had watched the entire proceeding from the doorway like a vulture waiting for a meal, seemed to shrink into herself. Her garish crimson dress, once a statement of defiant victory, now looked cheap and desperate in the cold light of this new reality. Without a word, she turned and slipped away, her retreat as quiet and ignominious as a ghost fading at dawn. Eleanor watched her go, not with triumph, but with the detached interest of a CEO noting a resolved liability. The power had not just shifted, it had been recalibrated to its natural state,
leaving the pretenders exposed, and the true heir firmly and quietly in command of the kingdom. The story broke not as a dry financial report, but as a full-blown corporate legend. Within hours, the business world was buzzing with the tale of the titan dethroned by the trophy wife he had so publicly scorned. Financial news channels ran segments with the sensational headline, "The $5 billion Mistake, How Arthur Vance's Arrogance Cost Him Everything." Society columnists, who had once chronicled his every move with fawning admiration, now recounted the Gala incident with biting, delicious irony, painting a vivid picture of a man so blinded by his own ego that he couldn't distinguish a simple dress from a declaration of war. He became a cautionary tale whispered in exclusive clubs and boardrooms, a punchline for the very elite he had tried so desperately to impress. His carefully curated image of the invincible, self-made genius shattered into a million pieces, replaced by the permanent, humiliating caricature of a fool who had criticized the frame while ignoring the masterpiece it held, a man who had lost an empire because he failed to look at his own wife. Arthur's losses cascaded far beyond public opinion. The divorce was swift and brutal, with Eleanor's legal team presenting a settlement that was less a negotiation and more a final, non-negotiable decree. He was forced to vacate the penthouse, its stark, minimalist walls now feeling like the inside of a tomb. His personal fortune, almost entirely tied up in Vance Tech stock, was decimated as the market reacted to the leadership change, a cruel irony given that Eleanor's steady hand was already stabilizing the company's future. Even his family, who had so eagerly participated in Eleanor's humiliation, now viewed him with a mixture of pity and contempt. His mother, Beatrice, coldly informed him that he had embarrassed the family name, while his brother stopped returning his calls.
Stripped of his company, his home, his fortune, and his sycophants, Arthur Vance was left utterly alone, a king without a kingdom, discovering the horrifying truth that his entire identity had been a hollow shell, built not on substance, but on the power he no longer possessed. In stark contrast, Eleanor's leadership at Vance Tech was a quiet revolution of substance over style. She didn't move into Arthur's ostentatious corner office. Instead, she chose a smaller, more accessible space, and her first act was to replace the garish modern art with photographs of the company's original engineering team. She immediately rehired the brilliant minds Arthur had fired, personally apologizing to them and empowering them to innovate without fear. She walked the factory floors, learning the names of the line workers and listening to their concerns. Her memos were not filled with buzzwords and empty proclamations, but with clear, concise strategies for sustainable growth and ethical practices. The employees, who had lived in fear of Arthur's volatile ego, responded with a fierce, renewed loyalty. They were no longer working for a brand, they were working for a vision. Eleanor wasn't just fixing a company, she was restoring its soul, proving that true leadership wasn't about commanding attention, but about earning respect through quiet competence and unwavering integrity. Months later, Eleanor found herself back at the art museum, not as a guest, but as the new chair of its philanthropic board, a position Arthur had long coveted. She stood in the very spot in the grand ballroom where he had publicly crucified her. The air was no longer thick with the ghosts of shame and humiliation. Instead, she felt a profound sense of peace, a quiet acknowledgement of the journey that had brought her here. The simple black dress was no longer a symbol of her supposed inadequacy, it was the uniform of her liberation. The Aurora heart, its purpose served, now rested in a secure vault, a tool of justice that had been put away. She realized the wound Arthur had inflicted had not left a scar, but had instead cauterized, burning away the last vestiges of the woman who believed her worth was defined by a man's approval. She was no longer Arthur's wife, she was Eleanor Croft, the architect of her own life, a woman who had learned that the greatest power was not in being seen, but in finally seeing herself clearly. On a quiet evening, she sat not in a cold penthouse overlooking the city, but in the warm, familiar silence of her father's library, which had become her true home and sanctuary. The room was filled with the scent of old books and fresh ideas. Through the window, the lights of the Vance Tech Tower, now simply the Croft Tower, glimmered in the distance, a testament not to a conquest, but to a restoration. She held a worn copy of her father's favorite book, its pages filled with his handwritten notes. There was no victory party, no champagne, no gloating. There was only a deep, abiding calm. She had not sought revenge, she had sought balance. And in the end, she had achieved it, proving the timeless truth her father had tried to teach her so many years ago. Wealth shouts, but fortune whispers. And those who are too deafened by the noise of their own arrogance will never hear the silent, patient, and inevitable approach of their own undoing. Her reign was just beginning.